Welcome to Disasters Maybe, a podcast about disasters in contemporary fiction. I'm Jordi Serrano Muñoz, and in this show, I talk with scholars and writers about what it means to invoke catastrophes to interpret our present and our future. I have this very clear memory of the moment. It was in 2004. I remember stepping out of the movie theater, the ABC Park in Valencia, and I was walking with my parents to the subway station. It was slightly drizzling and a bit cold, and I can recall this because I became very aware of the weather and the temperature. We had just watched Roland Emmerich's movie The Day After Tomorrow, which was, for many people of my generation, our very first encounter with a story that addresses very openly and very clearly climate change. In this movie, a very rapid melting of the polar caps creates very powerful weather events that lead to a sudden ice age. So New York becomes flooded and then covered under tens of meters of snow. In this story, the time it takes from understanding the changes to the environment associated with the climate crisis and then disasters hitting and transforming the world is just very, very short. The sense of urgency is overwhelming, and characters can't do much about anything except just survive. Now, think about a more recent movie. Adam McKay's Don't Look Up, starring Jennifer Lawrence and Leo DiCaprio. A clear end-of-pandemic movie where two astronomers discover a meteor that's about to hit the Earth and bring with it a new mass extinction. They spend most of the film trying to convince the authorities about that danger, fighting denialists and skeptics, and then seeing how some corporations believe they can make a profit out of this until, and this is going to be a spoiler, at the end of the movie, the meteor hits and kills everybody. So the meteor is, of course, a huge metaphor for the climate crisis. How, despite scientific consensus, there is a lot of resistance from politicians and from economic elites to act. And this creates this sense of apathy, of feeling defeated, and a reluctance to do anything despite knowing that a disaster is definitely there on the horizon. So fiction about the climate crisis, where it is set in the present or imagining speculative or dystopian futures, is dominated by catastrophic settings. In a very natural way, I think this makes a lot of sense. Disasters work very well in creating emotional appeal, in setting high stakes, in describing a clear conflict, something the characters need to face, need to overcome, need to escape from. But if we stop to think about it, facing a clear, well-defined disaster is just a limited part of the experience of living in an increasingly unstable world that is just one of the many most possible chapters that is living with an ongoing environmental crisis. Most of the time, both the causes and consequences of catastrophes are just too slow for our short attention spans, are just too invisible to the eye, or are happening elsewhere, outside of the reach of most people, especially people in the global north. So think of the increase in temperature, the acidification of the oceans, the melting of the polar caps. How do you make a story out of this? Not all disasters are climate crisis disasters, of course, but that means too that not every manifestation of the climate crisis can be expressed or imagined as a disaster. And yet, time and again, catastrophes shape our cultural imagination, both within and outside fiction, taking the role of the big bad wolf, putting up scenario and amping up the stakes so that we can feel an urgency, a threat, a need to act through characters that face a clear and well-defined problem. So traditionally, when we have spoken about disasters, there's been this tendency to differentiate between human and natural disasters, putting the emphasis on who or what causes the disaster. But I want you to question that and think of catastrophes more on what they mean for people instead of just what caused them. In fact, I want to join Australian scholar Kate Rigby in suggesting that there is no such thing as natural disaster. There might be natural triggers, phenomena that, from the point of view of tiny, vulnerable humans seem vast and overwhelming, but in reality, a disaster is just a cultural process, a way of integrating and making sense of something very large and very damaging. So think about it this way. An earthquake is only a disaster if it happens in a city and not in the middle of a desert. Otherwise, an earthquake is just a natural phenomenon. So recognizing disasters as cultural processes and letting go of the distinction between natural and human disasters matters. This conventional framing of some disasters as natural has actually made it more difficult to identify human responsibility for the climate crisis and has positioned nature as this adversary at a moment when thinking about the ways in which humans and the environment are connected is really urgent. So, if disasters are cultural products, how should we understand the climate crisis through the lens of catastrophe? Is it a single, gargantuan, all-encompassing cataclysm, or is it just a combination of multiple crises? Is it just one big problem, or is it a combination of different problems? This conceptual challenge matters, because the way we understand the climate crisis directly shapes how we can tell stories about it. So, my invitation is for people to think not only about how disasters tend to take a big role in stories about environmental degradation, about ecological collapse, about abnormal weather patterns, or any other stories about climate change, but also, and this is for me perhaps even more important, what it means that we are using disasters to imagine and describe these scenarios. So what can disaster do to our environmental imagination, both in terms of what it limits and what it expands? And in my research, in order to put this into one single term, I call it disaster distortion. So the bending of the conventions of narrative, both in what a story tells and how it tells it, to accommodate the disasters into the story, and in that to shape how the climate crisis is presented and understood in culture. So when a story describes a flood, it is addressing the climate crisis, even if readers know that climate change cannot be described just with a story about a single flood. This distortion emerges then when catastrophes are read as metaphors for the climate crisis. And maybe this process of turning a disaster into a metaphor is just unavoidable, but that doesn't mean that it is neutral. Our reliance on disaster stories shapes and then limits how we see environmental conflicts. It can amplify urgency, stakes, and scale, sure, but it also makes it harder to imagine catastrophes that unfold slowly across multiple spaces without this single visible threat. So maybe there's no asteroid, there's no volcano, there's no eye of the hurricane. It's just a frog getting boiled in the pot. And even though we know how that story goes, who wants to read it or watch it? Something that is constant about disasters is that they fundamentally break what had until then been considered normal. So when disaster strikes, people can no longer rely on the stable ground of how things work. So seasons become unpredictable, familiar places transform or disappear, social contracts dissolve, and the basic conditions for life just become very uncertain. This rupture is very attractive for storytelling because it becomes the center of a conflict, it's a driver for a plot, or it's a way of creating stakes. This disruption at the same time can produce new conditions for a story to be told, and this is something that interests me very much. So a linear narrative may fragment into flashbacks of the time before the disaster as characters struggle to orient themselves. Think, for instance, of Makoto Shinkai's very popular movie and the novel Your Name. The story centers on a comet strike that threatens to destroy a small Japanese town. The protagonists, two teenagers, swap bodies when they go to sleep, and then they later discover that they are also living in different timelines, one before the comet strike and the other 3 years after. They use this knowledge to prevent the strike in the story, but this strike is told out of order, offering interesting ways to understand causes and consequences of disasters and the people who live them. Disaster here creates an opportunity tell a story differently. Another type of distortion happens in the way space is represented. So catastrophes are so violent that part of the conflict of a story relies on exploring the way a place that used to be familiar turns unrecognizable. In Clare Moleta's novel Unsheltered, Lee, the protagonist, searches for her daughter across landscapes that have been destroyed by this ongoing environmental catastrophe. It is a very dystopian setting, and even though this country is based on real-world Australia, the way it is depicted is different enough to allow readers to question what it actually means to recognize a place in a story. In a similar way, La Noche, Zona, Night in the M Zone, by the Mexican author Alberto Chimal, imagines a not too far future Mexico City that has been split into warring zones. So clans that take the names of the present colonias, Chapultepec, Centro, Universidad, but splinter from what we would consider to be today the capital of the country. And finally, relationships between people also change under the new material conditions brought by a disaster. So disasters question who to put first, who to care, who to tend to, all these conflicts that appear usually associated with the idea of scarcity when anticipating or when surviving a catastrophe. In Tawada Yoko's Scattered All Over the Earth, Japan has mysteriously disappeared, sunk beneath the ocean, in theory due to the climate crisis, but it is actually left a bit fuzzy and unclear. The novel follows Hiruko, a Japanese immigrant living in Denmark, and her group of ragtag friends from different parts of the world as they travel to help her find another Japanese native speaker. In this story, the catastrophe happened at some point in the past, and there has been a process of accepting and adapting to a damaged environment. And this creates an opportunity to reflect on what it means to have border and national identities, and invites readers to imagine different ways of expressing love and care for people beyond the traditional labels such as friendship, motherhood, or romantic attraction. That means that disasters also creates this opportunity basically to expand our definition of care. So, to sum everything up, disasters are this cultural process, and many stories about the climate crisis tend to use a disaster frame. But that has consequences in the way we culturally shape our understanding of the climate crisis. Some are good, and some are perhaps not so much. In the following episodes, I will talk with scholars and writers about what it means to think disasters in our day and age through different perspectives. Stories about eco-anxiety, and also stories about the AI apocalypse, but also about other forms of loving and about inhabiting better futures. I am very happy to be sharing with you my conversations with my very smart and talented guests. I hope this series makes you think about what it means to imagine the end, either as an asteroid hitting us on a lazy Tuesday afternoon, or as this slow, haunting, most of the times a bit boring collapse of it all. Enjoy!